Jamal Carter stood in the courtroom, sweat slicking his palms, as Judge Vance smirked from the bench, gavel tapping a mocking rhythm. "Defending yourself, Mr. Carter? This'll be quick," the judge sneered, eyeing Jamal's calloused, grease-stained hands. The all-white jury shifted, some chuckling low. Victor Grayson, the real estate tycoon in a crisp suit, lounged beside his lawyer, radiating smug confidence. Jamal's voice sliced through, firm and unshaken. "Laugh now, Your Honor. I'm about to flip this upside down." Then the bailiff stuttered, "The case file's gone." What had Jamal unleashed? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. If you stand for justice against all odds, hit like and subscribe for more stories of grit and triumph. 6 months before that courtroom standoff, Jamal Carter woke to the sound of a leaky faucet dripping in his cramped duplex on Cleveland's east side. The place was a weathered shell in a fading industrial town, all rusted pipes and sagging ceilings, but it held a quiet dignity. His grandmother, Ruth, had willed it to him 3 years back, her final gift after a lifetime of scrubbing floors to keep it. At 32, Jamal worked as a mechanic, his hands always smudged with oil, his paycheck barely covering the bills. The duplex wasn't fancy, just 2 stories of chipped brick and creaky hardwood, but it was his fortress in a world that rarely let him breathe easy. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with life. Old men playing dominoes on stoops, kids kicking a deflated soccer ball down cracked sidewalks. Most folks here were black or Latino, families clinging to homes in a town that seemed to forget them. That morning the air hung thick and humid, the kind of heat that made shirts stick to skin. Jamal shuffled to the mailbox in his socks, expecting a utility bill or a flyer for some car wash. Instead, he pulled out a crisp envelope, the kind that screamed official trouble. His stomach knotted as he tore it open. "Notice of eminent domain, property acquisition by Grayson Enterprises," it read in stark black ink. The words blurred for a second before sharpening into a cold reality. Victor Grayson, the wealthiest man in Ohio's Rust Belt, wanted Jamal's block for a luxury condo tower. The letter offered $2,000 as compensation for his home, a number so low it felt like a spit in the face. Jamal's jaw tightened as he scanned further. Every house on his street got the same notice, all slated for demolition. In 30 days unless they signed over their deeds. He stood there barefoot on the splintered porch, staring at the paper until the edges crumpled in his fist. $2,000 wouldn't buy a shed, let alone replace the duplex Ruth had fought for. She'd told him stories of working double shifts at the steel mill, dodging rent hikes and predatory loans, all to keep this roof over their heads. It wasn't just a building, it was her defiance carved into every warped floorboard, a middle finger to a town that treated her like dirt. Now Grayson, a man who'd never set foot east of the river, thought he could snatch it for pocket change. Jamal's blood simmered. He wasn't signing anything. By noon he'd knocked on every door on the block. Mrs. Lopez, a widow with arthritis so bad she could barely grip her cane, clutched her notice with trembling hands. "They can't do this, can they?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Trey, a wiry 19-year-old who lived upstairs with his mum, just laughed bitterly. "They've been trying to push us out forever, man." The pattern was clear. Every targeted home belonged to someone brown or black, families who'd held on through factory closings and redlining. Grayson wasn't just buying land, he was erasing them. Jamal drove his beat-up pickup to City Hall, the letter stuffed in his pocket. The building loomed downtown, a grey slab of concrete with flags snapping in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and bureaucracy. He approached the counter, where a white woman with a pinched face and a name tag reading Karen sat flipping through a magazine. "I need to talk to someone about this," Jamal said, sliding the notice across the scratched glass. She barely glanced up, her lips pursing like she'd tasted something sour. "Eminent domain's legal," she droned, pushing it back. "Take the money or lose it all when the bulldozers come. That's how it works." "This ain't right," Jamal pressed, his voice low but firm. $2,000 for a whole house, that's robbery." Karen finally met his eyes, her gaze cold and dismissive. "It's progress. Maybe you should have sold earlier if you wanted more." The words stung, laced with an unspoken assumption. People like him didn't deserve better. Jamal leaned closer, knuckles pressing into the counter. "Who signed off on this? I want names." She sighed, flipping her magazine shut with a snap. "Council approved it last month. Grayson's got the paperwork, done deal." She waved him off like a fly, already reaching for her coffee mug. Jamal left City Hall with a fire in his chest, the kind that burned hotter with every step. Back home, he paced the duplex's tiny living room, the notice crumpled on the coffee table. The walls seemed to close in, whispering Ruth's voice. "Don't let him take what's ours." He couldn't just roll over. This wasn't about money. It was about power, about a rich white man deciding black folks didn't belong. In his shiny new vision of Cleveland, Jamal grabbed his phone, texting Trey and Mrs. Lopez, "We're fighting this, meet me tomorrow." That night he couldn't sleep. The faucet dripped louder, a steady plink against the sink. He lay on the lumpy couch staring at the ceiling when a crash shattered the silence. Glass sprayed across the floor as a brick thudded onto the rug. Jamal bolted upright, heart slamming against his ribs. He crept to the broken window, peering into the dark. Footsteps crunched away down the alley. On the floor, the brick glinted under the streetlight, a scrap of paper tied to it with twine. He snatched it up, unfolding it with shaking hands. Scrawled in jagged red marker were 3 words. "Get out, boy." The air sucked out of the room. Jamal's pulse roared in his ears as he gripped the note, the slur slicing deeper than the glass under his feet. This wasn't a warning from some faceless bureaucrat. It was personal, raw, a message dripping with hate. He sank onto the couch, the brick heavy in his lap. Outside, the neighborhood slept, oblivious to the war brewing. Jamal's mind raced. Grayson wasn't just coming for his home. He was coming for his dignity, his history, everything Ruth had bled for. $2,000 was an insult, but this was a declaration. They thought he'd run scared, tail between his legs. They didn't know him at all. He stood, tossing the brick aside, and grabbed a broom from the closet. Sweeping up the shards, he replayed Karen's smug dismissal, the council's silence, the red ink on that notice. Each piece of glass clinked into the trash, fueling a resolve that hardened like steel. He wasn't just fighting for a duplex anymore. This was about every family on the block, every name Grayson wanted to scrub from the map. The brick was there. First shot, a clumsy jab meant to break him. But Jamal Carter didn't break easy. He'd grown up fixing engines, piecing together what others called junk. Now he'd fix this too. By dawn, he'd patched the window with cardboard and duct tape, the jagged hole a scar he wouldn't let heal quiet. He sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, sketching a plan. City Hall was a dead end, but the people weren't. If Grayson wanted a fight, Jamal would give him one they'd feel all the way to the courthouse. The brick hadn't scared him off. It had lit a fuse. He didn't know it yet, but that fuse would burn straight through Cleveland, exposing rot deeper than he could imagine. For now, though, he stared at the notice, the red markers echo in his mind. They'd drawn first blood. His turn was coming. Jamal Carter didn't waste time after the brick smashed through his window. By the next afternoon, he'd rounded up half the block, a ragtag crew of neighbors squeezed into Mrs. Lopez's living room. The old woman perched on her faded recliner, her gnarled hands twisting a rosary, while Trey slouched against the wall, arms crossed tight. The air smelled of burnt coffee and desperation, the kind that clung to folks who'd been kicked too long. Jamal stood in the center, the crumpled eminent domain notice in one hand, a fire in his eyes that hadn't dimmed since the night before. "They think we're just gonna sign and scatter," he said, voice steady as steel. "But this ain't their land to take. We fight, we stay." Mrs. Lopez nodded, her frail frame trembling with something fiercer than fear. "My husband built this house with his bare hands. Grayson don't get to erase that." Trey kicked at the peeling linoleum, muttering, "Man's got the whole council in his pocket. What's yelling gonna do?" Jamal met his gaze, unflinching. "It's a start. They want to steamroll us. We make noise they can't ignore." The room buzzed with murmurs, a fragile hope stitching them together. By dusk, they'd agreed town hall tomorrow night. Jamal spent the next 24 hours stapling flyers to telephone poles, his boots pounding the pavement until his soles ached. The words screamed in bold Sharpie, "Save our homes, fight Grayson now." The town hall sat squat and ugly under a sky-bruised purple, its fluorescent lights buzzing like a swarm of flies. Jamal led his crew inside, a dozen strong, their footsteps echoing off the scuffed tile. The council chambers were packed, mostly white faces in pressed shirts whispering about taxes and potholes. Victor Grayson stood at the podium, all 6'4" of him draped in a suit that cost more than Jamal's truck. His silver hair gleamed under the lights, his smile polished to a predatory sheen. "This project brings jobs," he boomed, gesturing, "to a glossy blueprint of condos with rooftop pools. Progress for Cleveland, a better future." The councilmen nodded like puppets, their ties too tight, their eyes anywhere but the back of the room. Jamal pushed through the crowd, his neighbors trailing close. He didn't wait for permission, stepping into the aisle as Grayson paused mid-sentence. "Better for who?" Jamal's voice cut through the hum, sharp enough to turn heads. "You're stealing our homes, kicking us out for $2,000 each. That ain't progress, that's a land grab." A ripple of gasps spread, then applause from the back. Mrs. Lopez waved her cane like a flag, and Trey shouted, "Tell him!" Grayson's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed, pinning Jamal like a bug under glass. "Mr. Carter, is it?" he said, voice smooth as oil. "The city's within its rights. Eminent domain's the law." "Then the law's a thief," Jamal shot back. "You're targeting black and brown folks, wiping us out for your rich buddies. Call it what it is." The room erupted, cheers clashing with boos. Grayson raised a hand, silencing the chaos with a flick of his wrist. "I understand emotions run high," he said, dripping condescension, "but this is business, not personal." He nodded to his lawyer, Paul Hensley, a wiry man with a hawkish nose and a briefcase thicker than a Bible. Hensley strode forward, sliding a yellowed document across the council table. "This proves the Carter property was sold to a holding company in 1998, he announced, voice clipped. "Your grandmother signed it, Mr. Carter. You've got no claim." Jamal's breath caught, the air sucking out of his lungs. He snatched the paper, scanning the faded ink. Ruth Carter's name sprawled at the bottom, a shaky scrawl he'd never seen before. His grandmother could barely write by the end, her arthritis twisting her fingers into knots, but she'd never sell. "This is fake," he said, holding it up for the room to see. "She didn't sign this, you forged it." Hensley smirked, adjusting his glasses. "Prove it in court." For now, the council's satisfied. The head councilman, a balding, white man named Ed Pritchard, banged a gavel. "Motion carries. Grayson Enterprises proceeds." The vote was unanimous, a chorus of ayes from men who wouldn't meet Jamal's eyes. Defeat sank into his bones as the crowd thinned, Grayson shaking, hands like a king. Jamal's neighbors shuffled out, heads low, the fight leaking from them like air from a punctured tire. He stood frozen, the forged deed burning in his hand. How had they pulled this off? Had Ruth really signed something he didn't know about? No, he'd seen her burn the mortgage papers herself, a grin splitting her face as the ashes curled. This was a lie, a slick trick to bury him. He drove home in silence, the duplex's shadow looming darker than ever. He'd rallied them, given them hope, and it had blown up in his face. Was this how it ended? He barely made it inside before the pounding started. 3 sharp knocks rattled the door, loud enough to wake the dead. Jamal opened it to 2 cops, both white, their badges glinting under the porch light. "Jamal Carter," the taller one, grunted, his hand resting on his holster. "Yeah," Jamal said, gut twisting. The cop thrust a paper at him, the ink still wet. "Eviction order. You've got till sunrise to clear out." Jamal stared, the words blurring. "Council just approved Grayson's deal. How's this already here?" The shorter cop smirked, his buzz cut gleaming. "Fast-tracked. Don't make us drag you out." They turned and left, their cruiser idling at the curb like a vulture circling. Jamal sank onto the couch, the eviction order trembling in his grip. The forged deed had been bad enough, but this? They'd rigged the game before he'd even stepped into the ring. His mind spun, replaying Grayson's smug nod, Hensley's sneer, the council's averted gazes. This wasn't just business. It was a lynching with paperwork. They'd taken his win, his voice, and turned it into a noose. The clock ticked past midnight, each second a hammer blow. Sunrise was hours away, and with it, the end of everything Ruth had built. What could he do against a machine this big? Had he been a fool to think noise would matter? But then his eyes caught the flyer still pinned to the wall, its Sharpie bleeding defiance. He'd made them flinch even for a second. Grayson hadn't expected pushback, hadn't expected him. Jamal stood, crumpling the eviction order in his fist. They wanted him gone by dawn? Fine, he'd use every minute left to figure out their next move. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The cops thought they'd won, Grayson thought he'd won, but Jamal Carter wasn't done swinging. So, what do you think? Did Jamal make the right call standing up to Grayson, or should he have taken the 2000 and run? Comment number 1 if you think he's right to fight, even when the system's stacked against him. Like this video if you're rooting for the underdog, and subscribe to catch every twist in this battle for justice. Was that forged deed the knockout punch Grayson planned, or just the spark Jamal needed to burn it all down? Stick around to find out. Jamal Carter stared at the eviction order, its wet ink smudging under his thumb as the clock ticked toward sunrise. The duplex's walls creaked around him, a chorus of ghosts urging him to act. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not like this. The cops could drag him out kicking, but he'd make them earn it. He hauled an old dresser against the door, its warped wood scraping the floor, then grabbed a hammer and nails from the toolbox under the sink. Each bang into the window frames echoed through the empty street, a rhythm of defiance. By 3:00. The morning. The place was a fortress, every entry sealed tight. Let them try. He sank onto the couch, the eviction notice crumpled beside him, and pulled out his phone. The battery blinked red, but it'd hold long enough. He texted Trey. "Cops, coming at dawn, need you here." Then he called Keisha, his girlfriend of 2 years, her voice groggy when she picked up. "Jamal, it's late. What's wrong?" He swallowed hard, the weight of it all pressing down. "They're evicting me. Right now. Grayson's pushing me out." Silence stretched, then she sighed. "Take his money, babe. 2000's better than nothing." Her words stung, practical but cold. "This ain't about money," he snapped, sharper than he meant. "It's about them thinking we're nothing. I'm not signing my home away." Keisha's voice softened, but it carried an edge. "You're gonna lose everything fighting this. I can't keep watching you bleed for a house." Jamal gripped the phone tighter, his chest aching. "Then don't watch. I'm staying." She hung up, the silence louder than the creaking walls. He tossed the phone aside, alone again, but the sting fueled him. If Keisha couldn't see it, fine. He'd prove it to her, to Grayson, to everyone. He wasn't some pawn to be shoved off the board. Dawn broke gray and heavy, the sky spitting rain as tires crunched outside. Jamal peeked through the cardboard-patched window. 2 cop cars idled at the curb, lights off, engines rumbling. The same officers from last night stepped out, their boots splashing puddles, joined by a locksmith in a Grayson Enterprises jacket. Jamal's pulse hammered. They weren't wasting time. He grabbed Ruth's old baseball bat from the closet, its grip worn smooth, and stood by the door. The first knock came hard, rattling the dresser. "Carter, open up," the tall cop barked. "You're out of time," Jamal shouted back. "Not moving. You want to come in? Break it down." A pause, then a muttered curse. Metal clinked as the locksmith fumbled with the knob, but the nails held. The shorter cop kicked the door. Wood. Splintering but not giving. "We'll charge you with resisting," he growled. Jamal laughed, bitter and loud. "Charge me? You're the ones breaking in." The standoff stretched, rain drumming the roof, until sirens wailed in the distance. Back up. Jamal tightened his grip on the bat, ready for a fight he couldn't win. But then Trey's voice cut through, yelling from the street, "Y'all ain't taking him." Jamal risked a glance. His neighbor stood soaked, fists balled, glaring at the cops. It wasn't much, but it bought him a breath. The cops backed off, murmuring into their radios, and peeled away as the rain thickened. Jamal exhaled, slumping against the wall. They'd be back, but he'd held them off. For now, the duplex was still his. He couldn't stay barricaded forever, though. He needed a real move, something they couldn't smash through. The library downtown opened at 8. He'd seen books there on property law, thick ones with cracked spines. If Grayson could play dirty with forged deeds, Jamal could learn the rules and hit back harder. He slipped out the back, hood up against the drizzle, and hitched a ride with Trey to the library. The place smelled of mildew and dust, its shelves sagging under forgotten volumes. Jamal found a corner table, piling books on eminent domain and land rights, his mechanic's hands smudging the pages with grease. Words like injunction and due process swam in his head, foreign but sharp-edged. He scribbled notes on a napkin, piecing together a plan. Hours blurred, his stomach growling until he had it. A motion to stop the eviction, typed up on a public computer with typos he couldn't fix. It wasn't pretty, but it was his. The courthouse loomed a mile away, its marble steps slick with rain. Jamal trudged up, clutching his makeshift filing, the ink bleeding through the damp paper. Inside, the clerk's office hummed with quiet, efficiency, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He slid the motion across the counter to a young black woman with braids tucked under a scarf. She scanned it, eyebrows lifting. "You wrote this yourself?" she asked, voice soft but curious. "Had to," Jamal said, wiping rain from his brow. "They're stealing my house." She stamped it, lips twitching into a half smile. "Judge Vance will see it. Good luck." 2 days later, a letter arrived, slipped under the door while Jamal slept off exhaustion. He tore it open, heart pounding. Temporary stay of eviction granted, hearing scheduled in 7 days. Judge Harold Vance's signature sprawled, at the bottom bold and jagged. Jamal read it twice, relief flooding him. He'd done it, bought time, maybe more. He pictured Vance, a barrel-chested white man with a drawl thick as molasses and a Confederate flag pin glinting on his tie. The judge had smirked in the letter's margins, scrawling, "Let's see how long you last, boy." The slur landed like a punch, but Jamal grinned through it, let him laugh. This was a crack in their armor. He celebrated with a lukewarm beer from the fridge, the first quiet moment in days. The duplex stood firm, its patched window a badge of survival. He'd outsmarted them, at least for now. Grayson's cops couldn't touch him yet, and that forged deed. He'd crack it wide open at the hearing. For a fleeting second, he let himself hope. Maybe he could win this, keep Ruth's legacy alive. The beer tasted sweeter than it should have, the rain outside softening to a whisper. But peace never lasted long in Cleveland's east side. Dusk settled, painting the sky a bruised orange when shouts erupted down the block. Jamal stepped onto the porch, bottle still in hand, and froze. Flames licked the air 50 yards away, curling from Mrs. Lopez's backyard shed. The old woman stood in her nightgown, screaming as neighbors rushed with buckets. Jamal sprinted, hover, the heat stinging his face, and grabbed a hose from her spigot. Water hissed against the fire, but not before he caught the stench. Gasoline, sharp and deliberate. The blaze died slow, leaving a charred skeleton of wood and tools. Mrs. Lopez sank to her knees, sobbing into her hands, her rosary dangling limp. Jamal crouched beside her, chest tight. "Who did this?" he asked, though he knew. She pointed a trembling finger toward the alley, voice breaking. "Heard 'em laughing. Called me a dirty spick, said this was a warning." The words twisted in Jamal's gut, rage boiling over. He scanned the shadows, catching a flicker of movement. 2 figures slipping away, their silhouettes lean and mean. Grayson's goons. Had to be. The stay hadn't scared them, it had pissed them off. Jamal helped Mrs. Lopez inside, her frail body shaking against his arm, then stood guard on her porch till midnight. The shed smoldered, a black scar against the dusk. This wasn't just about him anymore. They'd torched her shed to send a message. "Fight back and we burn you out." Racial slurs hissed in his memory, a soundtrack to the flames. He'd won a round, sure, but Grayson wasn't playing by rules. The hearing was 7 days away, 7 days to brace for worse. Back home, Jamal locked the door, the bat propped by his side. Sleep wouldn't come, not with the smell of smoke still clinging to his shirt. He stared at the stay order, Vance's taunt glaring back. How long you last? Longer than they thought. Grayson's fire had meant to break him, but it had done the opposite, lit a match under his resolve. They'd underestimated him once, they wouldn't get a second chance. The temporary stay of eviction hung over Jamal Carter's duplex, like a fragile shield. its 7-day clock ticking louder than the drip of the faucet. For the first time in a week, he slept through the night, the baseball bat propped against the couch like a silent guard. Morning broke with a rare quiet, the rain gone, the air crisp enough to taste. He cracked the fridge, finding nothing but a stale loaf of bread and a jar of mustard, but even that felt like a feast. The shed fire still smoldered in his memory, Mrs. Lopez's sobs echoing, but the stay order in his pocket was a lifeline. He'd bought time to breathe, time to plan. Jamal spent the day digging, not with a shovel, but with his mind. He hauled his notes back to the library, the same. Corner table now a war room littered with coffee cups and crumpled napkins. The books on eminent domain had led him deeper, into case files and property records buried in Cleveland's archives. His fingers traced lines of tiny print until they landed on a pattern that made his pulse jump. Grayson Enterprises had snatched up dozens of homes over the past decade, all in black neighborhoods, all under shaky deals. Foreclosures with missing signatures, tax liens paid off by shell companies, deeds that didn't add up. Each one mirrored his fight. Families pushed out, their protests ignored, their homes razed for condos and strip malls. This wasn't random. It was a blueprint. He scribbled names and dates, his handwriting jagged with urgency. Grayson wasn't just a vulture. He was a machine grinding down anyone too poor or too brown to fight back. Jamal's duplex was just the latest cog. The realization burned, but it sharpened his edge. If he could prove this, show the world what Grayson was doing, maybe the stay wouldn't just hold, it'd break him. He needed eyes on this, not just his own. He tracked down a local blogger, a skinny white kid named Leo who ran a site called Rust Belt Truth. Leo met him at a diner, his laptop glowing under the greasy lights. "You got proof?" Leo asked, chewing a fry. Jamal slid a stack of photocopies across the table. "More than proof. A damn trail." Leo's eyes widened as he flipped through, grease smudging the edges. "This is big, man, like city shaking big." By midnight, the post went live. Grayson's land grab, how one man's stealing Cleveland's soul. Jamal's story led it, Ruth's duplex, the forged deed, the brick, the fire, followed by the list of vanished homes. Leo tagged every Tajm activist group in town, and by morning the post had spread like wildfire. Jamal's phone buzzed non-stop, strangers texting support, neighbors he'd never met vowing to stand with him. He stepped outside to find a crowd gathering near Grayson's downtown office, 50 strong, chanting, "No more steals." Signs bobbed in the air, some scrawled with his name. For a fleeting moment, he felt invincible. The pressure hit Grayson. Fast. 2 days later, a courier knocked on Jamal's door, a wiry guy in a Grayson Enterprises cap who wouldn't meet his eyes. He handed over an envelope, thick and heavy, then bolted. Jamal tore it open, his breath catching. Inside was a settlement offer, $50,000 to drop his fight and walk away. 50,000, not two, not a slap, but real money. His mind spun. He could fix the duplex, pay off debts, start fresh somewhere Grayson couldn't touch. He sat on the porch, the paper trembling in his hands, imagining Ruth's voice. Would she tell him to take it? Was this her legacy, a chance to escape? Keisha showed up that evening, her first visit since their call. She leaned against the railing, arms crossed, her braids catching the streetlight's glow. "Saw the blog," she said, voice softer than before. "You're making waves, Jamal, but this?" She nodded at the envelope. This could end it. 50 grand's a lifeline. He handed it to her, watching her skim the pages. Her brow furrowed, then her eyes narrowed. "Wait, look at this." She pointed to a clause buried in fine print. "Acceptance waives all rights to pursue legal action against Grayson Enterprises or affiliates." Jamal's stomach sank. It wasn't a lifeline, it was a gag, a trap to silence him forever. He snatched the paper back, tearing it in half with a rip that echoed off the brick walls. "They don't get to buy me off," he said, voice shaking with fury. "Not after. The brick, the fire, the lies." Keisha stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "I get it, but they're not going to stop. You sure you can take more?" He nodded, jaw tight. "I have to." She stayed a while, the silence between them heavy but warm, before slipping away into the night. Jamal stood alone, the torn settlement littering the porch. He'd chosen the fight over the money, and it felt right. Righter than anything in weeks. The protests grew louder downtown, voices carrying his name like a torch. He'd turned the tide, hadn't he? The answer came at dusk, a squad car rolling slow past the duplex, its lights off but its presence loud. Jamal watched from the window, bat in hand, until it parked a block away. Minutes later, boots hit his porch, heavier than the courier's. He opened the door to the same tall cop from before, his face carved with a smirk. "Jamal Carter, you're under arrest," he said, slapping cuffs on before Jamal could blink. "What for?" Jamal demanded, wrists twisting against the metal. "Trespassing," the cop grunted, shoving him toward the cruiser. "This property ain't yours no more, stays lifted." Jamal's knees buckled as they hauled him in, the duplex shrinking in the rear view. "Lifted? How?" he shouted, but the cop just cranked the radio, drowning him out. The courthouse steps flashed in his mind. Vance's scrawl. "Let's see how long you last." Had the judge flipped? Had Grayson pulled strings? The car jolted over potholes, each bump a hammer to his skull. The settlement had been a feint, a distraction while they yanked his win out from under him. He'd rallied the town, shamed Grayson. And this was the payback. Cuffs instead of cash, jail instead of justice. At the station, they tossed him into a holding cell, the door clanging shut with a finality that echoed. The walls stank of piss and rust, the bench cold against his back. He replayed it all, the blog, the protests, the offer, the arrest. Grayson hadn't just outmaneuvered him. He'd crushed him under the system's boot. The stay was gone, his home exposed, his fight mocked. Had he been naive to think noise could topple a giant? Was this the end of Ruth's legacy? He sank, his head into his hands, the cuffs biting his wrists. The cell was dark, but a flicker of rage still burned. They'd locked him up, sure, but they hadn't locked him out, not yet. What do you reckon? Should Jamal have taken the 50,000 and saved himself the pain? Or was ripping it up the only way to keep his soul intact? Comment number 1 if you think he's right to spit in Grayson's face, no matter the cost. Like this video if you're gripped by his stand, and subscribe to see if he claws his way back from this pit. Did Grayson's arrest trick snuff out Jamal's fire, or is it about to ignite something even wilder? Keep watching to find out. Jamal Carter sat in the holding cell, the cold steel bench numbing his legs as the hours bled together. The cuffs chafed his wrists, a dull ache pulsing with every shift. The jail smelled of sour sweat and bleach, the walls scarred with graffiti from men who'd been here before. 2 days stretched like years, each minute punctuated by the clank of bars or the shuffle of boots outside. The white guards paced the corridor, their voices low but sharp, slicing through the stale air. "Should have taken the money, Grease." "Hunky," one sneered, his buzz cut glinting under the flickering lights. "Now you're just trash we gotta sweep up." Jamal didn't flinch, staring at the floor, letting the words bounce off him. They wanted a reaction, a crack to widen. He wouldn't give it. The arrest still gnawed at him, a loop he couldn't stop replaying. Trespassing on his own porch, Grayson's. Doing, no doubt, a knife twisted after the torn settlement. The stay's collapse felt like a rug yanked mid-step, leaving him sprawled in this cell. Had Judge Vance caved to a bribe? Had the cops forged the lift order? Jamal's mind churned, but his body stayed still, coiled tight. He'd lost the duplex, the protests, Keisha's faith, everything but the ember of rage in his chest. That, they couldn't cuff. The second dawn crept through a slit of a window, gray and weak. A guard banged the bars, tossing a stale sandwich wrapped in plastic. "Eat up, Carter, you're out." Jamal blinked, suspicion narrowing his eyes. "Out?" The guard smirked, unlocking the cell. "Charges dropped, don't ask me why." Jamal stood slow, joints popping, and followed the man out. No explanation, no paperwork, just a shove toward the exit. He stepped into the drizzle, free but hollow, the station's shadow looming behind him. Something stank worse than the cell. Grayson didn't let go this easy. He hitched a ride back to the duplex with a cabbie who didn't ask questions, the rain streaking the windows like tears. The block came into view and Jamal's gut twisted. His front door hung ajar, swaying in the wind. The dresser he'd nailed in place splintered on the porch. He bolted from the cab, boots slapping wet. pavement and stormed inside. The living room was a war zone. Couch slashed open, stuffing spilling like guts. TV shattered, walls scrawled with jagged black spray paint. "Nigger, go home." The air thickened in his throat, a choke he couldn't swallow. Upstairs, his bed was flipped, clothes torn, Ruth's old photo albums shredded across the floor. Every corner reeked of hate, deliberate and deep. Jamal sank to his knees amid the wreckage, glass crunching under him. The bat lay snapped in two, useless now. His hands shook as he picked up a torn picture of Ruth, her smile ripped through the middle. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a gutting, a message carved into his life's bones. Grayson's goons, he'd bet his last dollar on it. They'd waited till he was locked up, defenseless, then ripped his world apart. The stay, the protests, the settlement, all distractions while they swung the real hammer. He pressed the photo to his chest, rage boiling over into something colder, sharper. They thought this would break him. They were wrong. He stumbled to the kitchen, the one room still half intact, and found a note taped to the fridge. Keisha's handwriting, shaky and small. "I can't watch you destroy yourself. I'm done." The words landed like a brick to the skull. She'd come by, seen this, and walked away. Jamal crumpled the note, his breath hitching. Alone didn't begin to cover it. Keisha had been his anchor, the one who'd stayed through the worst. Now even she saw him as a lost cause. He stood there, the silence roaring, until a faint buzz broke it. His phone, somehow still alive under the debris, lit up with an email. He fished it out, screen cracked but glowing. The sender's name froze. Him. Maria Vasquez, subject line blank. He opened it, eyes scanning fast. "I used to work for Grayson. Saw your blog post. They're forging deeds all over town. Check the attached." A zip file blinked at the bottom. Emails, scans, memos. Jamal's heart slammed against his ribs as he clicked. One memo stood out, dated a year back. "Carter property priority, fake the sale if needed, he's trouble." Another showed Grayson ordering cleanup on the east side, targeting problem tenants. Proof, hard and real, from someone who'd sat in the beast's belly. Jamal's hands steadied, the phone a lifeline in the ruin. Maria had risked everything sending this. Why? Did she hate Grayson that much, or was it guilt? He didn't care. This was his shot, a crack in the machine he could pry open. He forwarded it to Leo, the blogger, with a single line, "Blow this up." Then he grabbed a trash bag, stuffing the evidence inside. Ruth's torn photo, the eviction order, anything. He could salvage. He'd rebuild, but first he'd fight. The courthouse was his next stop. He'd file a new motion, shove Maria's docs in their faces, make them choke on it. He hitched downtown, the bag slung over his shoulder, rain soaking his hoodie. The courthouse steps gleamed wet and empty, the clerk's office quiet when he walked in. The same woman with braids looked up, her half-smile fading. "Back again?" she asked, eyeing the soaked bag. "Yeah," Jamal said, sliding a handwritten motion across. "Fraud claim, emergency hearing." She skimmed it, then paused, her voice low. "Sheriff's got a lock on evidence right now, something about a break-in. You sure about this?" Jamal's gut sank. A break-in? Convenient timing. He nodded, firm. "File it." She stamped it, but her eyes lingered, wary. "Judge Vance will see it. Might take a day." Jamal left, the rain heavier now, his mind racing. The sheriff, Grayson's lapdog no doubt, had lost the evidence locker. Bribed or bullied, it didn't matter. The docs were gone unless Maria had more. He texted her, no reply. The streets blurred past as he walked, the duplex's wreckage replaying in his head. He'd hit bottom, homeless, abandoned, cuffed and gutted. Was this what Grayson wanted? Him broken on the pavement? The thought clawed at him, but that ember of rage flared brighter. He'd lost everything but his will. Night fell, the city lights smearing through the downpour. Jamal crashed at a bus stop, the bench hard under his back, the bag his pillow. Sleep wouldn't come, not with the slurs on his walls burned into his skull. He'd won the stay, lost it, rallied the town, lost that too. Now this, trashed home, trashed life. But Maria's email was a rope, thin and frayed, pulling him up. If he could get those docs to stick, he'd turn Grayson's game against him. The hearing was his last swing, and he'd hit hard. He closed his eyes, rain drumming. The shelter's roof, and let the rage simmer. They'd pushed him to the edge, time to push back. Jamal Carter woke on the bus stop bench, his spine stiff from the cold metal. The rain a dull patter on the shelter's roof. The trash bag with Maria's email printouts and Ruth's torn photo dug into his side, a jagged reminder of what he'd lost and what he still had. His duplex was a ruin, Keisha was gone, and the sheriff had buried his evidence, but that memo in his pocket burned like a flare. Grayson's own words ordering the forgery were a weapon he could wield. He hauled himself up, joints creaking, and checked his phone. No reply from Maria, just a dead-end signal. He'd find her, though. She'd risked too much to ghost him now. The diner 50 miles north sat off a crumbling highway, its neon sign flickering, open in the grey dawn. Jamal hitched a ride with a trucker hauling steel, the cab rattling. With every pothole. Maria's email had a signature, M. Vasquez, ex-secretary, and a quick search on a library computer had pinned her here, pouring coffee for minimum wage. He stepped inside, the air thick with grease and burnt toast, and spotted her behind the counter. She was mid-30s, Latina, with tired eyes and a ponytail pulled tight. She froze when she saw him, her hand trembling on a coffee pot. "You, Jamal?" she whispered, glancing at the empty booths. He nodded, sliding onto a stool. "Yeah, you Maria." She didn't answer, just poured him a cup, black and steaming, and leaned close. "I shouldn't have sent that. If Grayson finds out," her voice cracked, fear raw in her throat. Jamal pulled the memo from his bag, flattening it on the counter. "He won't, but I need more. This says he faked my deed. What else you got?" Maria hesitated, then slipped into the back, returning with a battered USB drive. "Duplicates," she said, voice barely audible. "Emails, orders, lists of houses he targeted, all undesirables, his word, not mine." Jamal's jaw tightened as he plugged it into his cracked phone, scrolling fast. One email chilled him. "Carter's a spark. Snuff him out quick." Another listed cleanup jobs, dates matching evictions across the east side. "Why'd you keep this?" he asked, pocketing the drive. Maria wiped her hands on her apron, eyes distant. Saw too many families crying in his office, begging. He laughed about it. "I quit, but I couldn't unsee it." Jamal nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't just a whistleblower, she was a witness, a crack in Grayson's wall. "Come with me," he said. "Testify." She shook her head, fast. "I can't. He'll ruin me." He didn't push yet, but the USB was gold. He thanked her with a 20 he couldn't spare and hitched back to Cleveland, the drive burning a hole in his pocket. The courthouse loomed by noon, its marble steps slick with morning dew. Jamal stormed in, his hoodie dripping, and slapped a new motion on the clerk's counter. "Emergency hearing," he said, voice rough from no sleep. "Fraud and conspiracy." The braided clerk skimmed it, her eyes widening at the attached printouts. "This is heavy," she muttered, stamping it. "Vance'll see it tomorrow." Jamal crashed at Trey's place that night, a cramped apartment 2 blocks over. The USB copied to a borrowed laptop. He barely slept, replaying Grayson's words. "Snuff him out," until dawn broke. The hearing came fast, the courtroom air thick with tension. Judge Harold Vance lounged behind the bench, his Confederate pin glinting, a smirk tugging his lips as Jamal walked in alone. "You're no lawyer, boy," he drawled, tapping his gavel light. "What's this nonsense now?" The all-white jury shifted, some snickering, their suits crisp against Jamal's stained jacket. Victor Grayson sat beside Paul Hensley, his lawyer, both exuding smug calm. Jamal stepped forward, the USB in one hand, Maria's docs in the other. "This ain't nonsense, Your Honor. It's proof Grayson forged my deed and dozens more. He's stealing homes, targeting us, 'cause we're black." Vance's smirk faltered as Jamal plugged the drive into the court's projector, a grainy email flashing on screen. "Carter property priority. Fake the sale." Gasps rippled through the room. Hensley shot up, glasses slipping. "Objection!" Unverified evidence. Jamal didn't blink. It's verified by his ex-secretary. She'll swear to it. He bluffing. Maria wouldn't come, but the docs spoke loud. Another email listed undesirables with addresses all east side, all gone now. Grayson's face tightened, a vein pulsing in his neck. Vance leaned forward, eyes narrowing. This better hold water, Carter, or you're done. Jamal walked them through it, voice steady, pointing to dates, names, orders. The jury sat up, some scribbling, others glaring at Grayson. Hensley sputtered, "This is a fishing trip," but Vance waved him off. "Sit down, Paul, I'm reviewing this." The room held its breath as the judge skimmed the stack, his smirk gone, replaced by a scowl. After 30 minutes that felt like years, he banged the gavel. Case paused for review, 2 days. Jamal exhaled, knees weak. He'd stunned them. Vance. Grayson, the whole damn room. A win, small but real. He stepped outside, the sun harsh after the courtroom's gloom, and let the victory sink in. 2 days to breathe, maybe rally more support. Trey met him on the steps, grinning. "You see their faces, man, you shook 'em." Jamal nodded, a rare smile tugging his lips. He'd turned the tide, forced their hand. Grayson's team scrambled as they left, Hensley barking into a phone. Jamal felt it. Momentum, a crack he could widen. He'd sleep tonight, maybe even eat something hot. The fight wasn't over, but he'd landed a blow. Dusk settled, the sky a deep purple, when the blowback hit. Jamal walked back to Trey's, cutting through an alley to dodge the rain-soaked streets. Footsteps echoed behind him, too close, too fast. He turned, but not quick enough. A fist slammed into his jaw, sending him sprawling into a dumpster. 2 men loomed, faces shadowed, their boots heavy on the wet concrete. "You think you're smart," one growled, voice thick with hate. A kick landed in his ribs, sharp and deep, stealing his breath. "Next time you're dead," the other hissed, racial venom dripping from every word. Jamal curled tight, pain exploding through him as the blows kept coming, face, chest, back. Blood pooled in his mouth, coppery and warm, his vision blurring. The USB stayed safe in his pocket, but his body paid the price. They didn't touch it, didn't search, just beat him raw, a message in every strike. Minutes stretched into agony until they stopped, their laughter fading down the alley. Jamal lay there, rain mixing with blood, the pavement cold against his cheek. He'd won in court, sure, but Grayson wasn't playing legal anymore. This was war, and they'd drawn fresh blood. He dragged himself up, ribs screaming, and staggered to Trey's. The door barely shut before he collapsed, the room spinning. His win felt hollow now, the docs useless if he couldn't stand to use them. Had he pushed too far? Was this the cost of shaking their cage? He spat blood onto the floor, the taste lingering, and clutched the USB tighter. They'd nearly killed him, but they hadn't taken it. Not yet. 2 days till Vance ruled, 2 days to survive. So was Jamal's courtroom swing worth the beating, or should he have stayed low with Maria's gold? Comment number 1 if you think he's right to keep swinging, even with blood on the line. Like this video if you're hooked on his grit, and subscribe to see if he stands up again. Did Grayson's goons break his spirit in that alley? Or did they just stoke a fire he'll turn back on them? Stay locked in for the next round. Jamal Carter woke on Trey's couch, pain stabbing through his ribs with every breath, the alley beating a fresh bruise on his soul. His face throbbed, one eye swollen half shut, blood crusted on his lip. The USB drive dug into his hip. Still, safe, a small miracle amid the wreckage of his body. Trey hovered nearby, a damp rag in hand, his voice tight. "Man, you look like death. We gotta get you to a doc." Jamal shook his head, wincing as he sat up. "No time. Vance rules tomorrow. I'm not missing it." Trey cursed under his breath, but he didn't argue. Just handed over a mug of instant coffee, bitter and lukewarm. The mirror in Trey's bathroom showed a stranger, purple welts blooming. Across his jaw, a cut splitting his brow, his shirt stained dark. Jamal splashed water on his face, the sting sharpening his focus. Grayson's goons had meant to break him, to scare him off before the hearing. Instead, they'd lit a fuse. He cleaned up as best he could, swapping his torn hoodie for one of Trey's, and copied the USB to an old flash drive from Trey's junk drawer. Insurance in case they came for it next. His ribs screamed with every step, but he pushed through, the duplex's ruin and Ruth's shredded photo fueling him. Word of the beating spread fast. By noon, the east side buzzed, neighbors gathering outside Grayson's downtown office, their numbers swelling past 100. Jamal hobbled over, tray at his side, and found Mrs. Lopez there, her cane tapping defiantly against the pavement. "They won't burn us all," she said, voice fierce despite her frailty. Signs waved high. "Stop Grayson's hate. Justice." For Jamal, and chants rolled through the crowd, loud enough to rattle the glass tower's windows. Jamal stood at the edge, leaning on a lamppost, the pain fading under the roar. They weren't just fighting for him now. This was bigger. A tide he'd stirred. Grayson countered quick and dirty. By dusk, local news screens flickered with a smear campaign. Headlines screaming, "East Side protests led by drug dealer." A grainy photo of Jamal, taken during the arrest, flashed alongside claims he'd been caught with dope. Lies, all of it, but slick enough to stick. Trey scrolled through his phone, jaw tight. "They're saying you're a felon, man, people eating it up." Jamal's stomach churned as he watched comments pile online, half calling him a thug, half vowing to stand by him. The split cut deep, Grayson's poison turning neighbors into doubters. Had he misjudged the town's spine? He fought back the only way he knew. That night he crashed a council meeting, the same chamber where Grayson had waived his forged deed. The room hummed with suits and murmurs, councilmen sipping coffee, oblivious to the storm outside. Jamal limped to the podium, a megaphone borrowed from Trey's cousin crackling in his hand. "You're letting Grayson lie," he boomed, voice raw but steady. "He's smearing me because I've got proof, emails, orders, his own words. He's stealing our homes and you're helping him." The council froze, Ed Pritchard's gavel hovering midair. Jamal held up the USB, its black plastic glinting. "This says he targeted us because we're black and poor. You gonna let that slide?" The crowd outside roared, their chants seeping through the walls. Phones flashed, live streams catching every word. Pritchard stammered, "This isn't the place." But Jamal cut him off. "Then where is? You voted yes while he burned Mrs. Lopez's shed, trashed my house, beat me bloody." He pointed to his bruised face, the megaphone amplifying his rasp. "This is what he does when we fight." The room erupted, councilmen shifting, some pale, others glaring. A woman in the back yelled, "Tell him, Jamal!" And the tide turned. Boos drowned out Pritchard's gavel, forcing him to adjourn. By morning, the protests doubled, 200 strong, their voices a wall of sound. Judge Vance called an emergency session, rattled by the uproar. Jamal staggered into the courthouse, ribs taped by Trey's shaky hands, the USB clutched tight. Vance glared from the bench, his drawl clipped. "You're stirring trouble, Carter. Got anything new?" Jamal nodded, plugging in the drive. "Same proof, Your Honor, but louder. Grayson's scared. Why else smear me?" The screen lit up with Maria's emails, the jury leaning in. Vance scowled but reinstated the stay, muttering, "2 more days for review, keep it quiet." Jamal exhaled, a win carved from pain. The duplex was safe for now. He limped home to Trey's, the victory bitter on his tongue. 2 days to brace, maybe heal. He sank onto the couch, the protest still echoing in his ears, a lifeline he hadn't expected. Grayson's smear had backfired. Half the town saw. Through it, rallying harder. Jamal let himself hope just for a breath that he'd cracked the beast's shell. The USB stayed close, his battered body a testament to its power. He'd turned their lies into fuel, flipped the script. Maybe he could rest tonight, let the swelling ease. But Grayson didn't rest. Night fell, the sky a thick black shroud, when a boom shook the block. Jamal jolted upright, pain searing his side, and stumbled to the window. Flames danced 2 streets over, orange tongues licking the dark. He grabbed his boots, heart slamming, and ran, Trey shouting behind him. The air reeked of gasoline and rubber as he reached Keisha's apartment complex. Her car, a beat-up sedan she'd nursed for years, burned in the lot, its frame a skeleton of melting steel. Neighbors gawked, some filming, others yelling for water. Jamal pushed through, his lungs burning, and saw it. A brick beside the wreck, a note tied tight. He's next. His knees buckled, the world tilting. Keisha wasn't home. She worked nights at the warehouse, but this was her lifeline, her escape. He sank to the curb, the heat blistering his face as sirens wailed in the distance. Grayson's goons again. No doubt their warning scrawled in fire. They'd missed him in the alley, so they'd hit her. A racial blade aimed at his heart. The crowd whispered her name, some glancing at him with pity, others with fear. He'd rallied them, sure, but at what cost? The car hissed and popped, its death a scream in the night. Jamal stayed till the fire died, ash settling like snow. Keisha arrived, her warehouse uniform smudged, her eyes wide with shock. She saw the wreck, then him, and froze. "This cause of you?" she whispered, voice trembling. He couldn't answer, the guilt choking him. She turned away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving him with the note's weight. He's next. Grayson wasn't stopping. Beating Jamal hadn't worked, so he'd burn his world instead. The stay was back. The protests roared, but this was a new level of hate, a promise of worse. He stumbled back to Trey's, the note in his fist, the flames seared into his skull. Sleep was a ghost, chased off by pain and dread. The USB felt heavier now, a double-edged sword, proof that could save him or bury him deeper. Grayson had upped the ante, turned legal games into terror. Jamal's ribs ached, his hope frayed. But his jaw set hard. They'd hit Keisha to break him. They'd miscalculated. He'd heal, he'd fight, and he'd make them pay. Jamal Carter sat on Trey's couch, the charred smell of Keisha's car still clinging to his clothes, the note, "He's next," crumpled in his fist. His ribs ached, a dull throb pulsing with every breath, but the fire's afterimage burned, hotter in his mind. Keisha's voice echoed, sharp and broken, "This 'cause of you." She'd walked away, leaving him gutted, her silhouette fading into the night's chaos. Dawn crept through the blinds, grey and thin, as Trey paced nearby, his sneakers scuffing the worn carpet. "She's alive, man," Trey said, voice tight. "That's what counts." Jamal nodded, but alive wasn't enough. Not when Grayson's goons had turned her car to ash just to scare him. He stood, wincing, and grabbed the USB drive from his pocket. The stay was back, 2 days ticking down, but the bombing had shifted. The game. Grayson wasn't just fighting in court, he was waging war on the streets, racial hate his ammunition. Jamal couldn't wait for Vance's ruling. He needed more, something to bury the bastard. He texted Keisha, "I'm sorry, I'm ending this." No reply, just a void that stung worse than his bruises. She'd begged him to stop last night, her eyes wet with fear. "You're gonna get us all killed," she'd whispered before turning away. He'd refused, voice hard. "If I stop, he wins, not just my house, everybody's." She'd shaken her head, done with his fight. Jamal limped to the library, the USB copied to Trey's laptop as backup. The place hummed with morning quiet, its shelves a maze of dust and possibility. He slumped at a table, pain slowing his hands when a shadow fell over him. Ellen Pierce, a white librarian in her 50s with grey curls and a pinched frown, set a stack of books down. "Heard about the fire," she said, voice clipped but curious. "You're the one stirring up Grayson, right?" Jamal nodded, wary. "Yeah. What's it to you?" She slid a folder across, her fingers trembling slightly. "Tax records. Grayson's been dodging payments for years, funneling cash through fake companies. Thought you'd want him." He flipped it open, heart kicking up. Pages detailed Grayson Enterprises' shell games, millions siphoned, properties flipped, all tied to the East Side grab. "Why are you helping?" he asked, eyes narrowing. Ellen shrugged, adjusting her glasses. "Saw my brother lose his farm? To a guy like him. Hate bullies." Jamal pocketed the folder, a new ally in a sea of enemies. Ellen wasn't East Side, wasn't black, but she got it. Grayson's greed didn't care who it crushed. He filed fraud charges that afternoon, stapling Ellen's records to Maria's emails, a double punch for the courthouse clerk. "This'll shake 'em," he muttered, hobbling out. The hearing came fast, the courtroom packed with East Side faces, Mrs. Lopez in the front row, Trey beside her, their eyes fierce. Judge Vance slouched behind the bench, his Confederate pin winking, irritation creasing his face. "Back again, Carter?" he drawled, flipping through Jamal's filing. "Fraud now, huh?" Jamal stood, ribs screaming, and spread the evidence. Wide Maria's memos, Ellen's tax sheets, the USB glowing on the projector. Grayson's not just stealing homes, Your Honor. He's dodging taxes, rigging deals, targeting us because we're black. This proves it. Vance's scowl deepened, but the jury leaned in, whispers rippling. Paul Hensley jumped up, his tie askew. This is speculation. No witnesses, just papers. Jamal pointed to the screen, voice steady despite the pain. His own words, his own numbers. That's witness enough. Vance rubbed his temples, the room's heat pressing down. For once the judge didn't laugh. His eyes flicked to Grayson, who sat stiff, a vein throbbing in his forehead. Victory loomed, tangible as the sweat on Jamal's brow. Ellen's records tied Grayson's fraud to the duplex, a web Vance couldn't ignore. I'll rule tomorrow, Vance grunted, banging the gavel. Stay holds till then. Jamal exhaled, the crowd murmuring hope. He'd cracked them again. He crashed at trays, the high fading fast as pain clawed back. Ellen had texted, "Good luck tomorrow. Keep pushing." Her faith bolstered him. He wasn't alone, not completely. The East side rallied outside, chants drifting through the night. Grayson's empire wobbled, and Jamal had done it, battered but unbowed. He let himself dream of winning, of keeping Ruth's duplex, of proving Keisha wrong. Tomorrow could end it. Couldn't it? Morning broke with a chill, the sky a flat slate. Jamal woke to his phone buzzing, an unknown number. He answered, groggy. "Jamal Carter?" a woman asked, voice shaky. "It's Ellen's sister, she's gone." His stomach dropped, ice flooding his veins. "Gone?" The woman sobbed. "Left for work yesterday, never came home. Found her car by the river, empty. Note inside said, she talked." Jamal's breath hitched, the phone slipping in his hand. He hung up, the room spinning. Ellen, his lifeline, his surprise ace, vanished just as he'd hit Grayson hardest. He stumbled to Trey's laptop, hands shaking, and pulled up the news. Local librarian missing, car abandoned. No suspects, no leads, but Jamal knew. Grayson's goons, same as the alley, same as the fire. They'd taken her, silenced her, because she dared to help him. Guilt clawed his throat. Had he dragged her into this? He texted her number, a desperate, "You okay?" bouncing back undelivered. The folder she'd given him sat heavy on the table, a gift turned curse. The courthouse loomed by noon, the hearing's second day. Jamal walked in, hollowed out, Ellen's absence a weight on his chest. Vance glared, Hensley smirked, and Grayson sat cool as stone. "Where's your witness, Carter?" Vance snapped, flipping the tax records. "No testimony, no case." Jamal's voice cracked, but he stood tall. "She's missing. Grayson got to her." Hensley laughed, sharp and cruel. "Convenient excuse, motion to dismiss." Vance nodded, slow and smug. "Stays dissolved. Evidence inadmissible without her. Hearing's done." The gavel banged, a gunshot to Jamal's hope. The crowd gasped, Mrs. Lopez clutching her cane, Trey's fists balled tight. Jamal stood frozen, the USB useless now, Ellen's sacrifice for nothing. Grayson brushed past, his whisper cold. "Told you, boy, told." Outside, a note waited, pinned to Trey's door when Jamal got back. "She talked, you're done." The handwriting matched the car bombs, Grayson's signature, a racial dagger in every stroke. He'd won this round, snatching victory from Jamal's hands with blood. Jamal sank onto the couch, the note trembling in his grip. Ellen's car by the river, Keisha's burned husk, his trashed duplex, all tied to him, all because he'd fought. Had he pushed too far, cost too much? The East Side still chanted, but their voices felt distant, drowned by guilt and rage. Grayson hadn't just beaten him. He'd erased his ally, turned hope to ash. Tomorrow was gone, now what? Did Jamal play his hand too bold, or was trusting Ellen the only way to crack Grayson's shell? Comment number 1 if you think he's right to keep fighting, even when it bleeds others dry. Like this video if you're gutted by this twist, and subscribe to see if he rises from the rubble. Has Grayson's abduction buried Jamal's shot, or is there a spark left to light his next move? Stay tuned to find out. Jamal Carter slumped against the wall of Trey's apartment. Ellen's note, She talked, "You're done," crumpled in his fist, the weight of her disappearance crushing his chest. The stay was gone, dissolved by Judge Vance's gavel, and Grayson's smirk lingered like a ghost. Keisha's car still smoked in his memory, Ellen's empty sedan by the river a fresh wound. He'd lost everything: home, allies, hope. Yet the USB drive sat heavy in his pocket, a lifeline he couldn't let slip. Night cloaked Cleveland's east side, the chants outside fading to a murmur, but Jamal's mind raced. He wasn't done, not while Grayson breathed free. He couldn't stay at Trey's, not with Grayson's goons circling. "I'm out," he told Trey, voice rough, grabbing the trash bag of salvaged papers. Trey frowned, blocking the door. "Where? You going, man? You're busted up." Jamal pushed past, ribs aching. Somewhere they won't look. He hit the streets, hood up, and trudged to a junkyard 3 miles north, a sprawl of rusting cars and twisted metal. An old mechanic buddy. Rico ran the place and let him crash in a gutted van, its seats long gone. The air stank of oil and rot, but it was shelter, a hole to hide in. Jamal spread Ellen's tax records and Maria's emails across the van's floor, the dim glow of a flashlight flickering over the pages. His ribs throbbed, his jaw pulsed, but he dug in, desperation sharpening his focus. Ellen's folder was a goldmine. Grayson's tax evasion tied to East Side properties, millions dodged through fake fronts. Maria's memos named dates, homes, families, all black or brown, all erased. He needed more though, something Vance couldn't dismiss without her. He checked his phone, cracked screen glowing. A text from Ellen's number, sent before she vanished. "Back up online, cloud link in my last email." His pulse jumped. Had she planned for this? He hitched to a gas station with free Wi-Fi, the clerk eyeing his bruises but saying nothing. Huddled in a corner, he pulled up Ellen's email, fingers trembling as he clicked the link. A folder downloaded. Audio files, scans, even a video. One clip froze him. Ellen's voice, quiet but firm, narrating as she flipped through Grayson's books. "He's hiding cash, targeting minorities. I've got proof." The date matched her last shift. She'd known the risk, left him a lifeline. Jamal copied it all to the USB, his breath shallow. This was it, hard evidence, her voice from the grave. He needed to get it out fast. Trey met him at the junkyard, eyes wide when Jamal played Ellen's audio. "She's a hero, man," Trey said, voice thick. "We gotta use this." Jamal nodded, a plan forming. News station now. They hitched downtown, the city asleep under a moonless sky, and staked out Channel 7's back lot. A janitor left the door, propped for a smoke break. Jamal slipped in, Trey on lookout, the USB clutched tight. The control room hummed, a maze of blinking screens and cables. Jamal fumbled with a console, sweat beading, until he found a live feed slot. He plugged in, Ellen's voice crackling through. "Grayson stealing homes, breaking laws, here's the proof." The video hit airwaves at 2 in the morning, Grayson's tax sheets and Maria's memos flashing across Cleveland's screens. Jamal bolted before security stirred, Trey grinning as they vanished into the dark. By sunrise, the town erupted, protests tripled, 500 strong, blocking Grayson's office with fury. News vans swarmed, helicopters buzzing overhead. Jamal watched from a rooftop, ribs taped tight as chants shook the streets. "Justice for Ellen! Jail Grayson!" The east side roared back to life, a beast he'd woken. Judge Vance caved under the glare, ordering a full investigation that afternoon. His voice clipped on TV. "We'll dig into this." Jamal's chest swelled. A victory, carved from desperation. Ellen's ghost had flipped the board. Grayson's empire trembled, Vance's hands tied. He'd ambushed them, turned their silence into noise. The duplex might still stand. Ruth's legacy might hold. He limped back, to the junkyard, exhaustion pulling at him, but a flicker of pride burned through the pain. He'd done it, alone, battered from a van's rusted shell. Grayson's goons hadn't found him here, not yet. He let himself breathe, the investigation a lifeline he'd clawed into being. Dusk settled, the sky a bruised purple, when the Yi rally hit its peak. Jamal joined the crowd, blending in, Ellen's audio looping on megaphones. 500 voices drowned out the city's hum, a wall of defiance Grayson couldn't ignore. He stood near the edge, hood low, when a crack split the air. A gunshot sharp and close. Pain seared his shoulder, blood soaking his sleeve as he stumbled. Screams erupted, the crowd scattering, bodies shoving past. Jamal hit the ground, vision swimming, the USB slipping from his grip. A sniper high and hidden, Grayson's mark burned into the bullet. He clutched his arm, blood hot between his fingers, as Trey dragged him behind a car. "Stay down!" Trey yelled, panic cracking his voice. The rally dissolved into chaos, sirens wailing, feet pounding. Jamal's head spun, the junkyard's safety miles away. He'd aired the truth, shaken the town, and this was the payback. A bullet grazing his flesh, a racial death threat carved in lead. Grayson hadn't aimed to wound. He'd aimed to kill, missed by inches. The USB lay in the dirt, glinting under a streetlight as blood pooled beneath him. Trey pressed a rag to the wound, his hands shaking. "You're hit bad, man. We gotta move." Jamal gritted his teeth, pain lancing through him, and grabbed the drive with his good hand. "Not leaving it," he rasped, shoving it back in his pocket. The crowd thinned, cops swarming, but no one saw the shooter, just a shadow fading into the dusk. Jamal's shoulder burned, his strength leaking with every pulse, but he staggered up, leaning on Trey. The investigation was live, the East Side awake, but this was Grayson's real answer: murder over surrender. They stumbled to an alley, the junkyard too far, and ducked into a boarded-up storefront. Jamal sank against a wall, blood slicking his arm, the rag soaked through. His vision blurred, Ellen's voice echoing in his skull. "I've got proof." She died for it, and now he bled for it. Had he pushed the beast too hard? The rally had been his trump card, the broadcast his hammer, but Grayson's sniper turned it to ash. He clutched the USB, its edges cutting his palm, and forced his eyes open. The investigation might save him if he lived to see it. Jamal Carter slumped against the splintered wall of the boarded-up storefront, blood seeping through the rag Trey pressed to his shoulder. The sniper's bullet had grazed him, a hot streak of pain carving his flesh, but he'd kept the USB drive, its edges slick with his own red. Outside, Cleveland's east side pulsed with chaos, sirens wailing, shouts fading as the rally scattered under the dusk sky. Trey's hands shook, his voice a tight rasp. "You're bleeding bad, man. We can't stay here." Jamal gritted, his teeth, the world tilting, and forced himself up. "Not dying in no alley. Get me somewhere safe." Trey half carried him through back streets, the junkyard too far, the duplex a memory. They hit a safe house, an abandoned row house 2 blocks over, its windows dark, its door hanging loose. Mrs. Lopez's nephew, Carlos, ran it for strays and let them in without a word, his eyes widening at Jamal's state. The place stank of mold and stale beer, but a cot in the corner was dry. Jamal collapsed onto it, blood soaking the thin mattress as Trey taped his shoulder with duct tape and a torn shirt. "Hold on," Trey muttered, fetching water from a cracked sink. Jamal swallowed, the taste metallic, his mind clinging to Ellen's audio looping in his skull. By morning, the wound clotted, a raw ache pulsing under the makeshift bandage. Jamal sat up, slow and stiff, the USB safe in his pocket. Carlos brought a radio, its static crackling with news. Investigation launched into Grayson Enterprises after leaked evidence airs on Channel 7. The East Side hadn't slept. Protests swelled, 800 strong, their voices a battering ram against Grayson's tower. Jamal's broadcast had worked, forced Vance's hand. He grinned through the pain, a flicker of triumph cutting the haze. Ellen's sacrifice, his blood, they'd lit a fire the system couldn't douse. The investigation moved fast, fueled by the town's roar. By noon, reports hit. Grayson's offices raided, hard drives seized, accountants hauled in. A whistleblower, some. Clerk spooked by the heat, spilled on Vance's offshore accounts, tied to Grayson's payouts. Jamal listened, hunched over the radio as the net tightened. He'd done this from a junkyard van with a bullet in his skin. The duplex might still stand. Ruth's ghost might rest. He let himself hope, fragile as the cot beneath him, that justice was clawing through. 2 days later, Carlos drove him to the courthouse, the hearing rescheduled under public glare. Jamal limped in, bandaged and pale, the USB clutched tight. The room buzzed, packed with East Siders, reporters cramming the back. Judge Vance sat rigid, his Confederate pin gone, his drawl clipped. "You again, Carter?" He snapped, but the mockery rang hollow, drowned by the crowd's murmur. Jamal stood, pain lancing his shoulder, and faced him. "Yeah, me, with more." He handed over the drive. Ellen's backups loaded fresh. "Grayson's done. You gonna keep shielding him?" Vance scowled, but the jury's eyes locked on Jamal, their faces hard. He played the audio, Ellen's voice steady and damning. "He's hiding cash, targeting minorities." Then a video, grainy but clear. Grayson in a boardroom, smirking. "Clean out the trash, starting with Carter." The room gasped, a collective jolt. Mrs. Lopez clutched her cane, tears streaking her face, as Trey gripped Jamal's good arm. Vance's gavel hovered, his jaw tight. Paul Hensley leapt up, voice shrill. "This is inadmissible, no chain of custody." Jamal shot back. "It's his voice, his face. You saying he's a ghost?" The jury whispered, reporters scribbling. The air electric. Vance rubbed his temples, cornered by the sound of Grayson's own words. "Quiet," he barked, banging the gavel. "I'm taking this under advisement." Jamal held his ground, blood seeping through his bandage, the pain a badge. He'd stunned them again. Vance's smirk was dust, Grayson's cool cracked. The man himself sat stiff, his silver hair dull under the lights, a vein throbbing in his neck. Victory loomed, real and close, a reckoning Jamal had bled for. He staggered out, the crowd parting, their cheers a roar in his ears. Trey steadied him, grinning. "You nailed him, man. He's cooked." Jamal nodded, too tired to smile. The USB's weight gone from his hand, but heavy in his soul. Ellen's voice had done it, pierced the beast's heart. The investigation would bury Grayson, maybe Vance too. He'd won this round, turned desperation into a hammer. The duplex flickered. In his mind, a ghost he might reclaim. He let himself believe it just for a breath as he sank onto the courthouse steps. Night fell, the sky a thick shroud when the blow landed. Jamal crashed at the safe house, the cot creaking under him when sirens screamed close. He jolted up, pain flaring, and peered through a cracked blind. Flames roared 2 blocks south, a familiar silhouette swallowed by orange tongues. The duplex, his duplex, burning to its bones. Carlos ran in, breathless. "They torched it, man. Grayson's guys. I saw 'em peel out." Jamal's knees buckled, the world spinning. He stumbled outside, the heat hitting him like a fist, the fire's crackle a funeral dirge. The duplex blazed, its chipped brick crumbling, Ruth's hardwood curling to ash. Neighbors gathered, their faces lit by the glow, some sobbing, others cursing. Jamal stood frozen, the USB useless now, his win hollowed out. Grayson hadn't waited for the investigation. He'd struck first, burned Jamal's last tie to the ground. The flames danced, racial hate fueling every lick, a message louder than any courtroom ruling. "He's next" had been a promise, and this was the down payment. Smoke choked the air, stinging his eyes as the roof caved in. A thunderclap of loss. Trey grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "You can't stay here, man. They're hunting you." Jamal shook him off, voice raw. "Let him come." The fire roared, swallowing Ruth's legacy, every memory he'd fought for. He'd stunned Vance, cracked Grayson's shell. But this? This was a gutting, a racial scar seared into the night. The investigation might jail Grayson, but the duplex was gone. His home, his route, his proof. Had he won anything at all? The heat pressed close, the crowd's wails fading as he sank to his knees. Carlos dragged him back to the safe house, the fire's glow fading behind them. Jamal collapsed on the cot, blood oozing fresh through his bandage, the pain a dull roar. His shoulder throbbed, his ribs cracked, but the loss cut deeper. Ruth's voice silenced, her house ash. Grayson had lost in court, sure, but he'd hit back harder, turned Jamal's triumph to rubble. The USB sat on the floor, a mocking relic. He'd forced a reckoning, exposed the rot. But at what cost? Sleep wouldn't come, the fire's crackle looping in his skull. They'd burned his past. Now what? Jamal Carter lay on the cot in the safe house, the stench of mold mixing with the smoke still clinging to his skin. The duplex's fire burned in his mind, its collapse a hollow roar that drowned out the ache in his shoulder. Blood seeped through. The duct tape bandage, a slow drip staining the mattress, but he barely felt it. Ruth's home, his home, was ash, Grayson's racial torch snuffing out every splinter of her legacy. The USB drive sat on the floor, its black shell mocking him. He'd forced an investigation, cracked Vance's smug shell, but what did it matter now? The East Side chanted outside, 800 voices strong, yet his victory tasted like soot. Morning crept in, gray and heavy, the radio crackling with updates. Grayson Enterprises under siege. FBI joins probe after arson reports. Jamal sat up, ribs grinding, and listened. The duplex fire had lit a match under the town. Protests swelled to 1,000, blocking highways, their fury a tidal wave. Trey burst in, eyes wild. "They're tearing it up out there, man. Feds are at Grayson's mansion." Jamal's pulse jumped, a flicker of fight cutting through the haze. He'd lost everything, but the beast was bleeding too. "Get me there," he rasped, grabbing the USB. "Time to finish this." Carlos drove them, the row house's rusted pickup rattling through back streets. Jamal's shoulder throbbed, his vision blurring, but he gripped the door, the fires, ash fueling him. Grayson's mansion loomed on Cleveland's west side, a sprawl of white columns and manicured lawns, now swarmed by protesters and news vans. 1,000 East Siders ringed the gates, their signs sharp. "Burn Grayson, not us." Their voices a wall of sound. Jamal stumbled out, Trey steadying him, and pushed to the front. Cameras flashed, reporters shouting as he raised the USB high. "This ends now," he yelled, voice raw but piercing. He plugged it into a protester's megaphone dock. Ellen's audio booming. "He's targeting minorities." Maria's memos scrolled on a hacked newsfeed, Grayson's orders stark in black and white. The crowd roared, a primal surge, as Jamal turned to the mansion's gates. "You burned my home, Grayson, face me!" The words tore from his throat, blood flecking his lips, the pain a distant hum. Feds stormed the house, battering the door, their vests glinting under floodlights. Grayson's empire cracked, live on every screen, the East Side's rage a hammer he'd forged. The gates fell, protesters surging forward, Jamal at the helm. He limped onto the lawn, the USB a beacon as agents hauled files from the mansion. A reporter shoved a mic in his face, her voice shrill. "Carter, you started this. What's next?" He spat blood onto the grass, grinning grim. "Justice." The crowd cheered, a thunderclap as Grayson's windows shattered under thrown stones. Jamal's broadcast, Ellen's voice, Maria's leaks. They'd unleashed this, turned his loss into a reckoning. He'd lost the duplex, but he'd gained an army. Judge Vance ruled by noon, his voice tight on a live stream from the courthouse. Foreclosure voided. Grayson Enterprises indicted for fraud, arson, conspiracy. The gavel banged, a gunshot through the airwaves. Jamal stood amid the chaos, knees weak, as the East Side erupted. "You did it, man," Trey shouted, clapping. His back, pain lancing through him. The duplex was gone, but Grayson's fall was real. Feds cuffed his accountants, warrants out for his goons. Jamal had won, ripped the beast's throat open with nothing but grit and a dead woman's files. He sank onto the mansion's steps, the crowd's roar washing over him. Ruth's ghost lingered, her home ash, but her fight alive in this tide. He'd turned Grayson's racial torch back on him, burned his empire instead. The USB felt light now, its job done. A relic of a war he'd somehow survived. Trey sat beside him, grinning. "They're locking him up, Jamal. You beat him." He nodded, too tired to speak. The victory a bitter balm. The East Side owned. This moment, their voices drowning out the West Side's silence. He'd done it. For Ruth, for Ellen, for Keisha's tears. Night fell, the protests thinning, when the final blow landed. Jamal crashed at the safe house, the cot creaking under his battered frame when his phone buzzed. A video link, anonymous, no text. He clicked, the screen glowing dim. Grayson's face filled it, silver hair mussed, his smirk cold. "You think, this is over, boy?" he hissed, voice low and venomous. "You'll pay for this, every brick, every scream." The feed cut. a black void swallowing his threat. Jamal's blood chilled, the USB useless now, Grayson's escape a slap to his win. He stumbled outside, the night thick and froze. Sirens wailed close, boots pounding the street. Cops swarmed the safe house, their flashlights blinding, guns drawn. "Jamal Carter," one barked, a white face under a buzz cut. "You're under arrest. Arson on Pine Street." Jamal's gut dropped, the duplex fire flashing in his mind. "That's Grayson's work," he shouted, hands up, blood crusting his sleeve. The cop smirked, cuffing him rough. "Tell it to the judge. Got your prints on a gas can." The cuffs bit deep, his shoulder screaming as they shoved him into a cruiser. The crowd watched, stunned, their cheers dying as he vanished into the back seat. Grayson's video echoed, "You'll pay." A frame job, slick and fast. The feds had him cornered, so he'd flipped the board, pinned the fire on Jamal. His prints? Lies planted, but tight enough to stick. The safe house shrank in the rear view, Carlos and Trey yelling, powerless. Jamal's head thudded against the window, the victory ash in his mouth. The station loomed, its concrete walls a cage. They tossed, him in a cell, the door clanging shut, the stench of rust and despair thick. He sank to the bench, blood dripping fresh, the cuffs cutting his wrists. Grayson had lost the war but won this battle. Burned the duplex, framed him, slipped the noose while the east side mourned. Had he misjudged the beast's reach? The investigation rolled on, sure, but Jamal was locked, his win stolen by a lie. The cell's chill seeped into his bones, the crowd's roar a distant dream. He replayed it, the rally, the broadcast, the mansion's fall. He'd unleashed hell, toppled Grayson's throne. But this was the counter-strike, racial hate, twisted into a shackle. His shoulder throbbed, his ribs cracked, but his eyes stayed dry. Grayson thought he'd break him, lock him away, silence the spark. The USB was gone, handed off, but its truth lived in the streets. Jamal leaned back, the wall hard against his. Skull, and let the rage simmer. They'd cuffed him, sure, but the fight wasn't dead, not yet. Jamal Carter sat in the cell, the steel bench biting into his battered frame, blood crusting on his bandaged shoulder. The cuffs chafed his wrists, a dull ache pulsing with every breath, the jail's stench of rust and despair thick in his lungs. Grayson's frame job, arson on the duplex, had landed hard. The cops' smirks and planted gas can a racial noose tightening fast. Outside, the east side's chants faded, their thousand-strong roar silenced by his arrest. The victory at Grayson's. Mansion, the feds raid, Vance's ruling, all ash now swallowed by this cell's cold walls. He'd toppled an empire, only to be buried under its last swing. The hours bled together, a grey haze broken by the clang of boots and the drip of a leaky pipe. Jamal's mind churned, replaying Grayson's video. "You'll pay for this, boy." The bastard had slipped away, turned the fire he'd set into Jamal's shackles. Prints on a gas can, lies but slick enough to stick. His shoulder throbbed, the sniper's graze a raw scar, his ribs grinding from the alley beating. He'd lost Ruth's duplex, Ellen, Keisha's trust, and now his freedom. Had he fought too hard, pushed the beast till it bit back this deep? The USB was gone, handed off in the chaos, its truth useless behind bars. Dawn crept through a slit window, weak and pale, when the cell door rattled. A guard, buzzcut gleaming, tossed him a stale roll. "Visitor," he grunted, jerking a thumb. Jamal stood, slow and stiff, suspicion narrowing his eyes. "Who?" The guard smirked, unlocking the cuffs. "Some chick. Move." He shuffled, out, ribs screaming, and followed to a dim room, its table scratched, its chairs wobbling. Keisha sat there, her warehouse uniform wrinkled, her braids loose, eyes red but sharp. Jamal froze, the air sucking out of him. "You?" he rasped, sinking across from her. She didn't smile, her voice low and tight. "Saw you on the news, cuffed up. Grayson's video too, thought it was over." Jamal's jaw tightened, guilt clawing his throat. "It was him, Keisha, the fire, all of it. I didn't burn nothing." She nodded, slow, her fingers tapping the table. "I know, that's why I'm here." She slid a phone across, cracked but glowing. A video paused on screen. "Found this in my mail, anonymous, watch." Jamal's pulse jumped as he hit play, the grainy feed flickering to life. Grayson's face filled it, not the smug threat from before, but a new cut. His suit rumpled, his voice hushed. "Vance, it's done. Carter's locked, fire's pinned, pay up." Jamal's breath caught, the world tilting. Grayson's voice rolled on, casual and cold. 10 grand in the usual account. Keep him buried." The feed shifted. Judge Vance's office, a hidden cam catching him nodding, counting cash from a drawer. "Good. Investigation stalled. He's finished." The video cut, a black void swallowing the betrayal. Jamal stared, hands shaking. As Keisha leaned close. "Dropped off yesterday. I uploaded it. Went viral last night. East Side's rioting again." His mind spun. Grayson bribing Vance, framing him all caught raw, a twist he hadn't seen coming. He gripped the phone, the pain fading under a surge of fire. "How'd you get this?" Keisha's eyes hardened, a glint he hadn't seen in months. "Someone who hates Grayson more than you." Didn't say who. Jamal's chest tightened. "Maria, another insider." Didn't matter. This was a sledgehammer, Grayson's own arrogance cracking his cage. "You believe me now?" he asked, voice rough. She nodded, firm. "Always did. Just couldn't watch you die for it. But this changes everything." The guard banged the door, time up, but Jamal's mind raced. Keisha's video had flipped the board. Grayson and Vance exposed, the frame job unraveling live. He handed the phone back, a plan forming. "Keep it safe. They'll come for it." She slipped it into her pocket, standing. "They won't? Find me. Stay alive, Jamal." She left, her footsteps fading, leaving him with a spark he hadn't felt since the duplex burned. The cells swallowed him again, but the walls felt thinner, the air lighter. Grayson thought he'd won. Locked him. Away. He'd misjudged Keisha. By noon the jail buzzed, guards muttering, radios crackling. Jamal paced, the cot creaking as he passed, when a new guard stormed in, face pale. "Carter, out, now." He uncuffed him, shoving him toward the exit, no smirk this time. "What's happening?" Jamal demanded, ribs grinding. "Riots," the guard snapped. "Video's got the town on fire. You're clear." Jamal stepped into daylight, the east side a war zone. Cars burning, crowds clashing with cops, their chants a deafening roar. "Free Jamal! Jail Grayson!" Keisha's upload had blown it wide, 2,000 strong, tearing Cleveland apart. News vans swarmed, mics thrusting as he staggered out. "Carter, you're free. Grayson's nabbed," a reporter yelled. Jamal blinked, the words sinking in. Feds had snatched Grayson fleeing Ohio, his jet grounded 50 miles out, Vance resigning under a hail of warrants. The video, Grayson's bribe, Vance's cash, had gone global. A viral gut punch the system couldn't dodge. Jamal grinned, blood crusting his lip, as Trey pushed through, arms wide. "You did it, man. They're rebuilding the duplex. East Side's paying." The crowd lifted him, a battered king. Their cheers a thunderclap. He stood on the jail steps, the town a blur of smoke and triumph. The duplex rose in his mind, not ash but brick, rebuilt by hands that knew its worth. Ruth's ghost smiled. Ellen's voice echoed. Keisha's faith burned bright. Grayson's empire was dust, Vance's bench empty, and Jamal walked free, a mechanic who'd outsmarted them all. He'd turned their racial hate into a rope, hung them with it. The East Side owned this, their scars a badge, his fight their shield. Dusk settled, the riots calming, when a letter slipped under the safe house door. Jamal, back at Carlos's, tore it open, his shoulder still oozing under fresh gauze. The handwriting was new, sharp and cold. "This isn't over." No signature, no clue, but the threat hung heavy. Grayson was locked, Vance gone. Yet something stirred. A new shadow, a fresh fight. Jamal folded it, jaw tight, and stepped onto the porch. The duplex stood half-built across town, a skeleton of hope. But this note, this was a whisper of war. He leaned on the railing, the night cool against his skin, and smiled grim. They'd cuffed him, burned him, shot him, framed him, and he'd won. Grayson's video had been a plant, sure, but Keisha's find turned it inside out, a twist that broke the beast. The East Side rebuilt him brick by brick, but this letter promised more. Another giant, another game. Jamal straightened, the pain a dull hum, his eyes sharp. He'd learned their rules, beaten their system, let them come, he'd be ready. Jamal Carter's fight teaches us resilience can topple even the tallest towers. A mechanic with no law degree, he faced a racist system bent on erasing him, Grayson's wealth, Vance's bias, and a town ready to forget. Yet he didn't bend. He dug into books, rallied neighbors, and turned evidence into weapons, proving knowledge is power when the odds stack high. His story screams that justice isn't handed out. It's seized, step by brutal step, against fists, flames, and frames. Jamal lost his home, his allies, his blood, but gained a truth louder than loss. One voice can spark 1,000. Another lesson cuts deeper. Solidarity fuels the fire. Ellen's files, Maria's leaks, Keisha's twist. They weren't just help. They were lifelines from others crushed by the same boot. Grayson thrived when folks stood alone, but Jamal united them, turning whispers into a roar. The East Side rebuilt his duplex not because he begged, but because he showed them their own scars. Community isn't just strength, it's survival. When the system bets on your silence. Finally, vigilance never sleeps. Grayson's fall and Vance's disgrace didn't end the war. A new threat loomed in that letter. Power doesn't vanish, it shifts, waiting to strike. Jamal's genius wasn't just legal, it was learning the game, staying ready. We can't rest on wins, we must watch the shadows. So what's your take? Can one person really break a rigged system, or does it always claw back? Comment below if you think Jamal's fight proves the little guy can win. Like this video if his grit hit you hard, and subscribe for more tales of defiance. Share if you believe justice needs a voice. Thanks for riding this wild journey with us. Stay fierce, stay sharp, and keep pushing against the odds.